Welcome back to Threads of History, where we trace the long threads connecting past actions to history's defining events. Today we're going to look at the military experience and decisions that led up to the carnage of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, taking a long view of how military tactics developed in the preceding 2 centuries. We'll cover the birth of British linear warfare at Blenheim and Waterloo, the tactics that built an empire. We'll explore how the Crimean War transformed military disaster into a cult of honourable death. We'll examine the warnings from the American Civil War and the Boer War that were ignored because they were dismissed as colonial warfare. We'll look at how the honour culture of Britain's public schools created officers trained to die bravely rather than think tactically. And we'll see how technology, the machine gun, barbed wire, and high explosive shells made those centuries-old tactics lethal. Most importantly, we'll honour the courage and discipline of the British soldier, the common man who kept faith with a system even as that system was failing him. And we'll see how, at terrible cost, the British Army finally learned and adapted, transforming itself from the force that walked into machine guns in 1916 to the sophisticated combined arms army that won the 100 Days Offensive in 1918. This isn't a simple story of lions led by donkeys. It's something more nuanced, more tragic, and ultimately more human. It's about how success can breed fatal complacency, and how even the bravest men need the right tactics to win. Let's begin. July the 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. By nightfall, the British Army had suffered 57,000 casualties, 19,000 men dead. In a single day, it remains the bloodiest day in British military history. But this wasn't a story of cowardice, or incompetence, or men led by fools. This was something far more tragic. This was the story of a system that had won for 200 years, finally meeting a war it couldn't win. Blenheim, 1704, the Duke of Marlborough's army faces the French across the Bavarian plains. Watch those red-coated lines advance, perfectly drilled, perfectly disciplined. They march toward the enemy, stop at 100 yards and unleash disciplined volleys of musket fire. The French lines crumble. British infantry holds firm. Victory. But look closely at those red lines. These aren't aristocrats. These are common soldiers, farmers' sons, labourers, men from the slums of London, standing shoulder to shoulder, holding formation while cannonballs tear through their ranks. This is what made Britain different. Not just brave officers, but disciplined rank and file who trusted the system enough to stand and die in it. Fast forward to 1815, Waterloo. Wellington's infantry forms squares, human fortresses of bayonets and muskets. Napoleon throws his cavalry against them. The earth shakes, sabres flash, men die. But the squares hold. When Napoleon's cuirassiers thundered toward those formations, it was the common British soldier, the private, the ranker, who stood firm. Officers gave orders, but the men in the ranks made it work. They held their fire until the last moment. They trusted the man next to them would hold. That discipline, that trust in the system became the foundation of an empire. Wellington supposedly said the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. Perhaps, or it was another comment he made about the role of organised sport and a classical education in creating discipline. In reality, it was won by men who could neither read or had never seen Eton. Men from farms and factories who learned to trust that if they held the line, the man next to them would too. For the next 100 years, this system won. Egypt, India, Afghanistan, the Crimea, South Africa, linear tactics, disciplined firepower, rigid formations, officers leading from the front, success after success after success. And success breeds confidence, confidence breeds certainty, and certainty breeds complacency. October 25th, 1854, the Crimean War, the charge of the Light Brigade. A miscommunicated order sends 600 British cavalrymen charging directly at Russian artillery positions. They ride into a valley of death. Cannons to the left of them, cannons to the right, cannons in front. 20 minutes later, 110 men are dead, 161 wounded. The survivors ride back through the smoke, their horses shot from under them. A disaster, a catastrophic failure of command. But here's what Britain remembered. Not the tactical failure, not the incompetent orders, but Tennyson's poem, "Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die." Notice who Tennyson is really celebrating. Not Lord Cardigan, who gave the order and survived, not the staff officers safely behind the lines, but the 600 cavalrymen who rode into the guns. The British soldier, even in disaster, became the symbol of perfect obedience. And they had lived up to it. Despite catastrophic leadership, they charged. This became the ideal. A military disaster was transformed into poetry celebrating noble sacrifice. The lesson Britain took from the Crimea wasn't fix the tactics, or improve communications, or question foolish orders. The lesson was celebrate the courage, honour the sacrifice, obedience unto death. This was the age when Britain's public schools were mass-producing gentleman warriors. At Eton, Harrow, Rugby, the sons of the wealthy learned Latin and Greek. They studied the classics. They read about Spartans at Thermopylae, Romans falling on their swords. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. They learned this at 13. They believed it at 18, and they'd command with it at 25. The playing fields weren't just about cricket and rugby. They were about character, leadership, courage, the stiff upper lip, taking victory and defeat with the same calm demeanour. These schools valued bravery over brains, character over tactical innovation. A gentleman didn't study war too closely. That was ungentlemanly, overly technical, frankly a bit foreign. A gentleman led. A gentleman was seen to be brave. A gentleman died well, if necessary. But here's what the public schools couldn't teach. The actual discipline that made the system work. That came from drilling, from sergeants, from months of repetitive training, from regimental pride built over generations. While officers learned Latin and how to behave at dinner, working-class recruits learned to march 20 miles with full kit, to dig trenches in freezing rain, to maintain their rifles in mud, to fix bayonets in the dark. And most importantly, they learned to trust that their mates would hold. The officer class itself was protected by the purchase system. Until 1871, commissions could be bought and sold like property. A wealthy fool could purchase a colonelcy. A brilliant working-class sergeant would die in the ranks, no matter his talent. Even after purchase was officially abolished, its legacy lingered. The army remained a gentleman's club. Wealth and breeding still mattered more than tactical competence. But there was an unspoken contract in all this. Officers would lead from the front, visible, vulnerable, aristocratic courage on display, and the men would follow. It was a class system, yes, but it was also a bargain. We'll ask you to walk into hell, but we'll go first. And for generations, both sides kept that bargain. There was just one problem. Technology was changing. Muskets became rifles. Smoothbore artillery became rifled guns. Ranges increased. Accuracy increased. Lethality increased. Battlefields were getting deadlier. The killing zone was expanding. But the honour culture demanded more exposure to danger, not less. To take cover was cowardice. To study tactics too carefully was ungentlemanly. To suggest that visibility might be a liability was to question 2 centuries of tradition. The gentleman officer must remain visible, must disdain safety, must prove his courage through exposure. As the weapons got better at killing, the culture demanded men stand taller in front of them. The warnings were there. 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War. European military observers watched with interest as Union and Confederate forces dug trenches, built fortifications, and fired rifled muskets at each other from prepared positions. They watched men charge across open ground into rifle fire and die in their thousands. The future of warfare was right there, visible, documented. British observers dismissed it. Colonial warfare, not real war. Amateurs fighting amateurs. When European powers faced each other, when professionals fought professionals, it would be different. Then came South Africa, 1899 to 1902, the Second Boer War. Boer fighters, farmers really, used the terrain, took cover, wore earth-coloured clothing, moved quickly, shot accurately from concealment. British regulars in their red coats stood in formation and died. And again, it was the rank and file who paid for outdated tactics, stood in lines while Boers fired from cover, maintained parade ground formations while hidden riflemen picked them off. But here's the thing. They still stood. Even as comrades dropped around them, even as the futility became obvious, they maintained discipline. Some called it stupidity. It wasn't. It was faith in a system that had won for 200 years. The British Army learned nothing from South Africa, or rather they learned the wrong lesson. Yes, irregular colonial fighters used cover and mobility. But that was colonial warfare, uncivilized, ungentlemanly, the tactics of farmers and irregulars. When European powers faced each other, the rules would be different. Proper armies fought properly. This was a matter of honour, of civilization itself. Discipline, courage, and mass would prevail. Surely when Britain faced Germany, a real military power with its own honour culture, its own military traditions, both sides would fight correctly. In open battle, with proper formations, European against European. The old tactics would work again. They were half right. European armies did all fight the same way in 1914. They all believed in the offensive. They all valued elan and morale over firepower. They all had cavalry. They all expected decisive battles and quick victories. They all got slaughtered because the machine gun and barbed wire didn't care about European military tradition. The Maxim gun, 450 rounds per minute. One gun equaled 30 riflemen. High explosive shells, barbed wire by the ton. Rifled artillery that could hit targets 6 miles away. Every European power had these weapons. Every European power knew what they could do, but every European general still believed in the cult of the offensive. Attack, aggression, morale. To question this was to question national character itself. 12 years between the Boer War and the Great War. 12 years to question the tactics, to study the lessons, to adapt. But why would they? The Boers were irregulars. The Germans would be different. European war would be fought by European rules. In August 1914, the old army marched to war with old ideas, expecting an old kind of war. They were about to discover they were wrong. August 1914, the British Expeditionary Force lands in France. The old Contemptibles, as they'd come to be known, 100,000 professional soldiers, the best trained army Britain had ever sent to war. German intelligence called them a contemptible little army. The Kaiser would learn otherwise at Mons, at Ypres. Outnumbered British regulars held the line through discipline and rifle fire so rapid the Germans thought they faced machine guns. 15 rounds per minute. Aim. Fire. Professional soldiers doing what they'd trained for. These were the last of the old army, and they were magnificent. But they were being destroyed. Within months, most would be casualties. The professionals who'd held at Mons would be gone. By winter 1914, both sides were digging in. The war of movement everyone expected became 400 miles of trenches, from the Swiss border to the English Channel. The square formation of Waterloo became a trench line stretching across France. And in those trenches, the private soldier adapted faster than his officers. Within months, he learned the new rules. Don't silhouette yourself on the parapet. Keep your head down. Respect the sniper. Watch for trench mortars. Listen for tunnelling. Small unit tactics. Trench raids. Listening posts. This was innovation from the bottom up, learned in blood. But the big picture, the grand strategy, that still came from the top. And the top was still thinking Waterloo. By 1916, the old regulars were mostly gone. Kitchener's new army filled the trenches. Volunteers, civilian soldiers, clerks, miners, teachers, shop assistants, PALS battalions, men from the same towns, the same streets, enlisting together, whole neighbourhoods in uniform. They brought enthusiasm, but not years of professional drilling. They were civilians in uniform, yet somehow they maintained the discipline. The regimental pride, the trust. Mates from the same streets, fighting together, refusing to let each other down. The system still held them. By 1916, General Douglas Haig commanded the British forces in France. And Haig was planning something big, a breakthrough, the big push, the Somme offensive. Haig wasn't a fool. History has often painted him that way, but he was applying principles that had won at Blenheim, at Waterloo, across a century of colonial wars, concentration of force, sustained bombardment, disciplined advance. On paper, with 1815 technology, the plan was sound, but the machine gun had rewritten the rules and no one had updated the playbook. The plan: a week-long bombardment, 1.5 million shells, pulverise the German trenches, destroy the wire, break their will. Then the infantry would advance at walking pace. Walking pace. Why walking? To maintain formation. Because running would break the line, scatter the men, destroy unit cohesion. And breaking formation had meant defeat for 200 years. The officers would lead, carrying swagger sticks instead of rifles to show calm courage, visible to their men, visible to the enemy. Because that was the contract. Officers first, leading from the front. And here's where the contract between officer and men became a suicide pact. The plan demanded discipline over survival, parade ground order in an industrial war. The officers would lead, visible and vulnerable, and the men would follow, both sides keeping the bargain. One German machine gunner watching the British prepare would later write, "They came on like they were on parade. We felt we were murdering them, but we had to." July 1st, 1916, 7:30 in the morning. The bombardment stops. 7 days of noise, then sudden, shocking silence. Then whistles. All along 18 miles of front, the signal, and they went. They climbed out of the trenches, formed lines, and walked toward the German wire. Officers first, keeping the contract, swagger sticks, whistles, then the men behind them in waves, in formation. Some units kicked footballs across no man's land, some sang. The Tyneside Irish, the Grimsby Chums, the Accrington Pals, towns going to war together. They knew what they were walking into. The week-long bombardment hadn't hidden German positions. The wire wasn't cut. They could see it, still standing. They knew. Listen to their letters, their diaries. "We're going over tomorrow. The wire's not properly cut. We all know. But orders are orders." This wasn't ignorance. This was faith. The system said, trust your training. Trust your officers. Trust the man next to you. For 200 years, that trust had won battles, so they walked. The German machine gunners emerged from their bunkers, 30 feet deep, untouched by the bombardment. They set up their guns, took aim, and fired. One German MG-08 machine gun could fire 450 rounds per minute. It took 30 trained riflemen to match that firepower. But British tactics were designed for battles where both sides had rifles. The Germans had brought machine guns to a rifle fight, and nobody had updated the playbook. The neat British lines walked into enfilade fire, interlocking fields of fire, planned, prepared, rehearsed. By 8 a.m, thousands were down. By noon, tens of thousands. By nightfall, 57,000 British casualties. 19,000 dead. The officers kept their part of the contract. They died first, leading. Junior officers had a life expectancy of 6 weeks on the Western Front. On July 1st, they died at 3 times the rate of their men. But the soldiers, the common soldiers, kept coming. Even as the first waves were cut down, subsequent waves climbed out and advanced. Some units lost 90% of their men in the first hour. And that's not stupidity, that's discipline so deep it overrides survival instinct. Here's something remarkable. The French army would mutiny in 1917. The Russian army would collapse. The German army would eventually break. But the British rank and file, for all the horror, all the futility visible in front of them, largely held. Why? The regimental system. Fighting with men from your town, your street, your mates. You couldn't let them down. The rotating leave system. Enough hope of escape, of home, to keep going. Rum rations, mail from home, small mercies in hell. But most importantly, the officers were still dying beside them. The contract was being kept, even if the contract was killing everyone. There's something terrible and noble about that. They weren't being asked to do what their officers wouldn't. They were all dying together, bravely in the wrong war. And they kept going. For 4 more months. August, September, October, November, attack after attack, the common soldier learned, rushing in small groups instead of walking in lines, using shell holes for cover, smoke screens, fire and movement. From the bottom up, adaptation. But orders still came from the top, and the British infantrymen still followed them. 420,000 British casualties by the time the battle ended in November. And still, no collapse. The discipline held. The horror was penetrating culture now. Wilfred Owen, who'd fought in the trenches, wrote a poem in 1917, Dulce et decorum est. He described watching a man die in a gas attack, choking, drowning in his own lungs. And he ended with these lines, "My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country." Owen called it what it was, a lie. The honour culture that had sent men walking into machine guns was being named, finally, as the killer it was. But something else was happening. Finally, the high command was listening. The rank and file had been inventing new tactics in the trenches for years. Now, finally, they became doctrine. The creeping barrage, artillery fire moving just ahead of advancing infantry, forcing defenders to stay in their bunkers. Platoon tactics, small units with their own initiative, bypassing strong points, infiltrating gaps. Combined arms, infantry, tanks, artillery and aircraft working together, coordinated, taking cover, camouflage, surprise, all the ungentlemanly tactics that actually worked. Winning became more important than dying nobly. The casualties forced another change. Meritocracy, reluctant but real. Grammar school boys became officers. Sergeants were promoted for tactical competence, not breeding. Men who'd risen from the ranks brought trench-fighting expertise to command positions. The class barrier was cracking because the common soldier had proven he could think as well as obey. The rigid hierarchy was bending, finally. Tactical competence was starting to matter more than breeding. August 1918, the 100 Days Offensive begins. The same British Army, the same regiments, many of the same men who'd walked into machine guns in 1916. But now they advanced in rushes, small groups, using cover, tanks led, artillery crept ahead. Aircraft spotted targets. They bypassed strong points, infiltrated gaps, moved at night, used deception. This wasn't won by different men. This was won by the same soldiers, now properly led. They'd always had the discipline, the courage, the willingness to trust. Now they had the tactics to match. They broke the Hindenburg Line, Germany's strongest defences. They drove the Germans back in open warfare for the first time since 1914. By November 1918, the British Army was the most tactically sophisticated force on the Western Front. The British soldier had never been the problem. His courage, his discipline, his willingness to trust the system, all of that was real and valuable. It just needed to be pointed in the right direction. But the cost: 886,000 British dead. Over 4 years. Most of them ordinary men. Most of them doing exactly what they were asked. The system had asked everything of them, and they'd given it. The tragedy isn't that they broke, it's that they didn't. Their discipline, their courage, their faith in the system. It was so strong that it took years of industrial slaughter to finally force change. If the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, then the errors of the Somme were made there too. Not through incompetence, but through consistency. The same education and tradition that taught Wellington's officers to stand firm, taught Haig's officers to advance steadily. The same courage that broke Napoleon's cavalry walked into Maxim gunfire. They were trained to be heroes, and they were heroes. But heroism isn't enough when the technology has changed and the tactics haven't. The playing fields had prepared them perfectly for the last war. Not this one. But here's what we should remember. The British soldier from Blenheim to the Somme to the 100 Days Offensive showed something remarkable. Not blind obedience, but disciplined courage. The willingness to trust the system, trust your mates. Do your duty even when the system was failing you. That's what held the line at Waterloo. That's what walked into the guns at the Somme. And that's what ultimately won in 1918 when the tactics finally caught up. The playing fields of Eton produced the officers. But the factories, farms and terraced houses of Britain produced the men who made it all work. And when the officers finally learned, those men showed what they'd always been capable of. The Somme wasn't a failure because British officers and soldiers lacked courage or discipline. It was because they had too much of both, enough to keep faith in a system that was killing them, until the system finally changed. At least they learned. The lessons of 1916 to 1918 would shape British military thinking for generations. Never again would courage alone be enough. Never again would tactics be sacred. Never again would tradition trump innovation. The Somme killed the old certainties. And out of that death came something harder, smarter, less romantic, but effective and alive at terrible cost. They learned. If this kind of historical deep dive interests you, please subscribe to Threads of History. Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you have any subjects you would like me to cover, let me know. Next time, we'll be pulling on another thread from history. Until then, remember, the past isn't just dates and battles. It's decisions, traditions and systems that build over time until they reach a breaking point. Thanks for watching.